Hello everyone and welcome again to Exercise Physiology for Sport Week 9. I'm Professor Mark Baines at Concordia University and we're in the fall term, October 15th to 20th, talking about fatigue, exercise testing, and performance factors. Talking first about chapters 14 and 19, a couple chapters from our last week. First and foremost, talking once again about risk. In terms of all forms of risk, the primary one we have the most ability to impact and change with our athletes or anyone we're trying to help when it comes to exercise and performance and well-being is behavior. Certainly we don't want our athletes or people to smoke. We don't want them to drink. We don't want them to have poor eating habits. We want them to take good care of themselves outside of the time they're with us. When they're with us, however, we can affect their work behavior. And that specific hour or 2 or 3 hours we have with them can play a major role over their ability to handle the stress that they incur over the course of the next 23, 47, 71, or 95 hours, whatever it is, between the next time they see us, between now and then. So we certainly have a huge impact upon us being sure we plan. And yes, I'm beating you over the head with these concepts. Some of you are doing a really, really good job of actually saying every week, talking about the specific impact of the specific work periods. Don't just say a lot of high work, high intensity, or short work period. What amount of time? 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 9 seconds, whatever it is. Rest period. Don't just say short rest or depends on what you're doing. What rest specifically, so I know what you're saying. It's one thing to show me one time that you kind of understand something. You have to repeat it enough times for it to really sink in. And the fact of the matter is, when I don't see you repeat these concepts over and over again, I either one, don't think you have them, which concerns me, or two, you're not thinking it's that important, maybe both, which we don't want to have be the case. So that's why I keep asking for the same things and I keep having you lose points in your discussion board posts if you don't specifically give me numbers for an idea of what you're talking about. And that said, of course, looking also at what our max force output is, our RPE, our heart rate is, or VO2 max estimation is. Although VO2 max, we can't estimate it specifically in the middle of a test without actually testing someone with expensive equipment. We can give a possible range or idea in mind. We'll talk more about that here shortly as well. But we can absolutely impact their behavior. That's the biggest impact you have as a coach in your time talking with your athletes before and after practice, during practice, and what you do in the work. Okay? And I can't stress that enough how important our job is in that respect. Not just about performance, scholarships, and possible professional careers if we have such fortune to have such good athletes, and they do as well. If not, it's just get them better and keep them getting better and keep them maintaining those same life lessons over the course of the many, many months and years to come. Okay? And as far as American College of Sports Medicine, American College of Sports Medicine does a lot of research in our field, and they came up with, along with the National Institute of Health now about 13 years ago, a study that I have a hard time finding now. I think they made it go away from public knowledge because it was a little stringent for expectations. They basically came up with, if someone's going to avoid metabolic syndrome, avoid diabetes, avoid heart condition, major health issues, most people who did that engaged in at least 30 minutes of moderate or higher level intensity exercise on a daily basis. 3.5 hours plus per week. That's what they did. Actually, the number was 3.75 hours. And most people don't do that, so they shouldn't be shocked they have health issues. Our athletes are not that category. They may be in the future years. I have to watch out for it. I'm almost 50 myself, so I'm now in those categories making sure I get that exercise. Not so much for you with your athletes you're working with now. The next category is fitness, to be fit, to have reasonable levels of strength and speed and power and those kinds of things. Reasonable levels, good body composition, good capacity to handle stress, right? It's an average of an hour a day, 7 hours a week, okay? And then, of course, they came up with people who have the least health issues after 10 plus years of studying them, and the most highest performance levels, of course, were people engaged in 90 minutes or more on average per day, 10.5 hours a week. Not a shocker if you're currently a high school or a collegiate athlete, let alone professional athlete. The rest of the world, far lacking in that regard, right? But those are important numbers, and that was given to the general population, not even given to professional athletes, which we're talking about, or people try to be the high-level collegiate or high school athlete 2, 3, 4, 5 hours or more per day sometimes, right? It's a big difference. But we're just talking about normal well-being, okay? That said, those numbers are important. You don't want to forget that. It's really baseline importance for us with people ongoing in the days and years ahead. How do we avoid fatigue? Well, for us, it's really 4 primary factors with our people we're working with. Are they getting enough sleep, right, for the behavioral focus points here. Are they getting enough sleep? How are they dealing with life stress as a whole? How's school going? How are your relationships going? Maybe you want to have that kind of discussion. Maybe you don't. But you have to understand that it impacts them and plays a role. We've all had tired days, and here I expect you on a bad week for you to still do well, right? You expect your athletes to give everything they have even though they're not feeling well. Well, we do have to take some things into account. We need to ask them for feedback to tell us what's going on. Otherwise, we assume everything's perfect, that you're doing fine, so we expect the ultimate level, optimal performance. We have to have those conversations. And we have opportunities to measure that without actually asking specific questions that are more than numbers, which we'll get back to in a second here. Nutrition, right? Certainly eating better and taking care of themselves, and of course, exercise. 4 factors: sleep, life stress, nutrition, exercise. Trying to find a good balance, all 4 of those things. Hard to do, yes. When it comes to us, we have the fitter principles. Okay, we talked about them briefly, and you'll keep getting more and more confirmation of those concepts in the next few weeks. Next couple weeks, we have your last few chapters of our course. Frequency: how often do you train? Should be every day. If your goal is to improve any sort of baseline parameter of performance or fitness or let alone health, got to be every day. If we're talking about cardiovascular endurance, at least every other day, probably every day ideally. Crazy athletes, twice or more per day. Maximal or more towards strength endurance. Not so much strength, low level, like, you're talking about type 1 muscle fibers, your work periods are minute plus, kind of glycolytic, maybe a little bit type 2A fibers, that kind of thing. Now we're talking about work periods a minute or more, okay? Otherwise, we're talking about that like every other day, 24, 48 hours between. Maximal strength, maximal power, I should say hypertrophy, it's about 40 hours between, maybe 72 hours between. Come back and do that work again. And we're talking 72 to 96 hours before maximal power and maximal strength. But you don't want to not be doing something between those days. You just don't want to do anything that actually incorporates that same joint action, the same level of stress that you would have gone under 2, 3, 4 days ago. You don't want to do it for at least 3 or 4 days. That same chest press you did at work period 20, 30 seconds with a 3-minute rest, high maximal output and a 90% plus max force output, 3 to 6 sets, whatever it might be, some of those categories. Those kinds of things we don't see anymore in every 3 or 4 days. Be careful, please be careful. I've given you guys, some of you, a little bit of a hard time about it. It's really important you understand. We've all become too used to, as I did as well, counting reps. Stop counting reps. Stop counting reps. Say we're going to do 10 seconds. That's maximal, ultra short performance. That's power, speed, work. We're going to go for strength. All right, it's 20, 30 seconds. Could be as little as 10 seconds. Somewhere in there. Set the timer. Go. Here's that workload. Keep going with that workload the entire time. Oh, we want maximal power? All right, here's 5 seconds. Do 1 or 2 reps, okay? But don't do the reps. Go for time, because the right tempo or speed and the right duration of time gets you the right benefit, whereas the number of reps does not necessarily get you the right benefit. And it gets people not focusing on quality, it gets people focusing on quantity. There's a difference there, okay? Something to really think about. Intensity. 4 measures of intensity I keep kind of bugging you on. Some of you are doing a very good job with. Some of you are not putting it in your post. And you're losing 10, 20 plus points every single week when you don't say it, because I don't think you're getting the ideas. RPE. End of every set. Scale 1 to 10. How do you feel? Level 6? I thought it was going to be a level 7. Okay, we probably can go a little harder. It's too easy for you. Or whatever your goal was for that particular set, right? You should already know in advance what it is. Light day, 5, 6. Harder day, 7 or 8. High intensity, 9, 10. Heart rate. I'm expecting the heart rate to be kind of low, not terribly high if we're not overly intense, or we've only had 1 or 2 sets. I'm not expecting the heart rate to jump through the roof necessarily after 1 set, right? Multiple sets of any higher intensity type activity is going to have higher or raised heart rate. I want to be clear about what the expectation is for that, and making sure that we know it's going to be below 80%, below 70%, whatever it might be, relative to VO2 max. Not a bad idea if we're talking about training endurance athletes. VO2 max is less of a big deal if you're not really looking at aerobic capacity needs, if your sport's not really involving that. It certainly is in soccer, certainly is in basketball, certainly is in lacrosse, certainly is in tennis. For those of you coaching, and I know what you're coaching from us talking the last several weeks. If you're coaching sprints, football, basically sports like that, you're not going to see it quite as often, but it still plays a role. Football goes play after play after play after play with only 30 seconds break. Aerobic aspect is part of it, just not as much, right? So we don't put as much time and emphasis on it. But as far as intensity, you got to measure 4 things, not just one, not just how fast do we do that in, or was that good level of effort? Great. No, got to do all 4. Okay, max force output percentage, VO2 max for endurance activities. Certainly RPE, and certainly heart rate. Yep, everything. They can quickly put their hand on the radial pulse, right there at their thumb side for 6 seconds. Your book actually is reversed to 10 seconds, but multiplying by 6 is much more difficult in your head of the moment than it is doing it for 6 seconds and adding a 0 to it. So that's the only reason. But yeah, you go longer. The problem with going longer is the longer you take that rest, that heart rate post-set, the more the heart rate's going down, and you're going to see the person recovering. That's why you don't want to go more than 6 to 10 seconds for measuring the heart rate, because that's giving you a quick little glimpse of what the heart rate's doing right now. Okay. T is time under tension. Ultra short performance, that 10 seconds or less, we're talking about for maximal power, maximal speed, that assumes you're going 95, 100% maximal force output, above 90+% VO2 max, that kind of thing. If you're not, then we're really not calling it, although it's still short-term performance, that's not the same thing. We're expecting you're going all out for that 10 seconds or less. Type 2X muscle fibers requiring 3 to 5 minutes or more rest. It talks in your textbook talking about rest periods of 30 seconds or less for football. They're talking about training you for games. When you're talking about training for game conditioning, yes, you want to match simulate and match the best of your ability how it's going to be in an actual game, or tennis, or track and field, or soccer, any sport you're coaching, that's true. But please do not confuse what is maximal power and what is power endurance as it relates to your sport. They are not the same. So when the book almost kind of confuses it a bit, makes it sound like that's anaerobic power. It's not. If you go over 10 seconds and you have a 30-second break, that's not maximal anaerobic power. It's nowhere near it. It's not possible. And they talk about ratios of 3-to-1 or 2-to-1 rest. Honestly, without trying to be too dismissive here, I'd throw that out the window. We already understand energy systems. When you understand energy systems, you know how much rest is required between sets. Don't worry about ratios. Go based upon the expectation of rest required, based upon the maximal force output you just had your athlete engage in, based on the work period they had. Okay? But I wouldn't worry about ratios. Really wouldn't. That's way too much emphasis put on that. It's like foot contacts. I'm trying to measure foot contacts rather than looking at overall force output or performance and speed. It was far more important than trying to measure the number of footsteps. I'm going to talk about your timing, like for you, those of you coaching things like hurdles, things like that, or jumpers. Yeah, you got to count footsteps because you got to make sure you get the timing right. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about practice overall, the number of footsteps you took all practice, that kind of thing. Don't count that stuff. You want to be more curious or more focused toward the actual performance, and the parameters we're looking at will help you understand that, the ones we just mentioned. Okay, and otherwise, tempo or type of tool you're going to use. That's a very important thing. Speed is always slow when you're trying to learn a skill. You pick that speed up when the goal becomes speed power. Okay, otherwise it's moderate speed for everything else, right? And of course, rest periods. We did the ultra short-term performance. It's 3 to 5 minutes. We're talking about that short-term performance. It's basically it's about 10 seconds to 180 seconds. Well, it's a lot of crossover in there. The very beginning, near that 10 seconds, is more ATP, CP, starts becoming more glycolytic. That 3 minutes is getting more and more toward aerobic. But you're in that with 60, 90-second time frame, you're pretty solidly glycolytic, pretty solidly more towards type 2A muscle fibers. And when that goal is to maximize high-intensity interval training, it's 20, 30 seconds work period. If your goal is to maximize the output from your intervals. 20, 30 seconds work period with never more than 60, 90 seconds rest period. 60 seconds might be a little short. If you have to go longer than 90 seconds, don't qualify it as a high-intensity interval, because it's not. Because it's more towards the ultra short type performance. It's just you're trying to go too high of a rate. You can't keep repeating that performance. You're not glycolytic. Okay, you're getting taxed to the point where you're not able to maintain that level of glycolytic capability performance-wise. You're actually moving more toward the aerobic performance-wise, even though you're trying to have the goal of glycolytic type performance, of the short-term, short-burst activity. You're getting slower. We don't want that. Okay. Rest periods, of course, need to be very, very short, not very long at all for that intermediate performance, where we're talking about that 3 minutes to 20 minutes. We're talking about that moderate length, we should say, 3 to 20 minutes. That's where VO2 max is tested, 10, 20 minutes, somewhere in there. Your critical power goes to about 20, 30 minutes. How fast you can go and maintain it, we actually refer to as more 20, 30 minutes. We'll talk more about that in a minute here. But your rest periods don't need to be very long. That kind of thing, that intensity-wise is probably less than 70% VO2 max, maybe even less than 60% when you start going above an hour of activity in the longer-term performances. Okay, yeah, your brain needs to be able to fire off these numbers. And if you ever get confused about it, let me know, being that we have to be able to break it down clear enough for your sport. I want you to have it down. Okay, and my hope is to be able to make that clear for you by the time we finish week 11. Okay? And of course, that said, detraining, if you don't train at all, well, you won't be tired. You just won't get anything done. You try to do anything, that will make you tired. Neural fatigue, or not neural fatigue, but we're losing our neural training capabilities in as little as 3 weeks, 21 days, when things start to go big downhill about 10% plus performance-wise if you take 3 weeks off. So that's why a general rule is don't take more than 2 weeks off from activity if you want to maintain where you are. Okay, as little as 1 or 2 days a week on off season or on vacations, things like that, can maintain where you are for several months potentially. That's a huge thing. Just 1 or 2 sessions, probably 2. Okay, what most research would say. 2 of our typical type training sessions can maintain where we are, cardiovascular-wise or strength-wise, hypertrophy-wise. If we do that over the course of 6 months, we can actually maintain where we are. Pretty impressive stuff. That said, by about month 3, detraining, we're going to start losing by 20% or more our performance capabilities, which is not a good thing. If you remember before, we said before as well that hypertrophy, muscle size, you can gain back what you lost in 6 months as little as 6 to 8 weeks. If what you lost, what you once had. Pretty impressive stuff. You could be off for 6 months, and actually whatever you had before, hypertrophy-wise, size-wise, you can gain back that which you lost in as little as 6, 7, 8 weeks. Doesn't mean you will, means you can. Whereas VO2 max, we're talking about double that or more to get back to where you were after 6 months off. It's a dramatic difference in the requirements for VO2 max. Why is that? Well, muscle size or hypertrophy is type 2A fibers, right? When we're talking about endurance type work, longer duration work, that capacity to handle such longer duration stress, even though it's such low intensity stress, requires a much greater skeletal muscle adaptation. And that's what we're talking about. Because remember, we talked about performance when it comes to endurance events is not about heart and lung adaptation so much as skeletal muscle adaptation to that stress. Okay, and that's a big difference. And then lastly, for VO2 max, to increase it, you got to be doing typically that 21, 60 minutes, somewhere range, level of work duration, which is more toward that moderate length duration. The intensity needs to be minimally 50% VO2 max, or minimally somewhere around 65% max heart rate. It's not that you have to try to make them go above that. You just got to tell them it's got to be mildly, at least mildly to moderately challenging to get anywhere in aerobic capacity benefit. Okay, anything above 85%, we start going more toward the anaerobic threshold for everybody, right? Whereas people who are deconditioned, as little as 40-50% of VO2 max is already going to be anaerobic for them if they're totally deconditioned, which is why we don't go into high intensity stuff in the beginning of the season for anyone who has not been under regular ongoing training for many, many months. If they haven't been, you got to consider their anaerobic threshold to be much lower, their VO2 max to be much lower, so we have to train at a much lower rate. Despite the fact we're saying we only have 3 months till season's end, well, we want them to perform at a high level, don't we? So we still have to adapt to them, even though we're not happy about it. Might want to remind them that. You still got to train them at the right level, the appropriate level, not the level you want them to be where they're not ready. Okay? And the anaerobic threshold increase, best way to improve that, and VO2 max at the same time, 2 forms of training. Steady state running, which is like your critical power, right? Go as fast as you are able to maintain for that 20 minutes plus, okay? Whereas critical power by definition refers to indefinitely. You know, patient go indefinitely. It's not going to be very fast for indefinite power, but certainly over the course of a 21, 60-minute run, you know, it's a strong pace, okay, whatever that might be, or a swim if you're a swimmer, or a cycling if you're a cyclist, right? For most of you, other than a couple of you as a swim coach, one of you guys is swimming, and almost everybody else I think is on land, if I can recall correctly. So pretty much you're talking about critical power as it relates to running, okay? And the anaerobic threshold is also going to be increased by doing a steady state running. And the other is high intensity interval training. Too much is put upon it as if high intensity interval training is the best way. Nope, one of 2 primary ways. Steady state, moderate duration lengthwise running, as well as the high intensity interval training. And you can't do high intensity interval training more than a couple a week for more than several weeks. So what you're going to find is tremendous central nervous system fatigue and peripheral fatigue both, and you're going to see a decline in performance. I can claim that one exactly myself. In my attempts to train for Olympic Games back now almost 20 years ago, my dreams of an Olympic athlete were dashed pretty quick when I wore myself out trying to train at an elite level way too fast, making a jump that I wasn't ready for. I needed to give myself a lot more time to adapt and develop. I tried to make a huge jump from my collegiate level days to going to elite level. It's a big jump, right? Be careful of those big jumps for our athletes. Important concepts now for this week. Lactate threshold. Don't confuse that with onset of blood lactate accumulation. That starts to come on first. That lactate threshold comes next. When you start to fatigue, can't actually keep producing force. Technically, the anaerobic threshold technically comes after that. Although lactate threshold, onset of blood lactate accumulation, and anaerobic threshold are all often referred to as the same. They're not exactly the same. Technically, the anaerobic threshold is slightly above later after the lactate threshold actually occurs. And the best way to train to improve that is just train within your VO2 max, not get out of breath, to train the point where you're doing work periods that you're able to handle stress for at least around 45 seconds or more. Right? Obviously, if you can go easily more than 45 seconds to several minutes to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes, same pace, probably not going to do a lot for your lactate threshold. For most people, it's probably too low of an intensity. But it's going to start somewhere in that range. Remember that you start getting that tremendous development of lactate, extra hydrogen ions at high intensity performance-wise around 45 seconds. So that's your work period, 45 seconds to 10, 20, 30 plus minutes to work on lactate threshold improvement for the capacity to handle stress. Right? And of course, it really helps benefit athletes who are engaging in stress for 12, 50 minutes and beyond, not so much our short burst type athletes as much. Okay? The anaerobic or ventilatory threshold, as we just mentioned, we're at a point where you're out of breath, or at least not out of breath, but you're not able to maintain a normal breath pattern. You're having a little difficulty talking a little bit, that kind of thing. You've gone anaerobic. Okay, cardiovascularly, you are anaerobic. You're probably, for most people, you're at least 60, 70% VO2 max, at least 70, 80+% max heart rate. You might even be lower than that for someone who's deconditioned. A well-conditioned athlete might not reach that anaerobic threshold to closing on 70+% VO2 max, 75, 80% VO2 max. Very unusual, but that's a really elite top level athlete that we're talking about. And how do you improve that? Well, you have to train just right at that point. That's why we say you want to be running at a pace or moving at a pace where you're not having difficulty breathing. It's not easy to breathe, but you can talk. Coach said, "How are we doing?" "Doing okay, coach. I'm doing okay." It's all right. It's getting tough. You can't talk very much, right? You'd be out of breath at that moment. You wouldn't be able to talk again without taking a significant breath. Okay, but you can't be having a hard time talking, that kind of thing. We're so far past the point. You got to understand one simple thing: when your athletes cannot talk, I will bet my career on it, their performance is waning. They're going down. They're slowing down. I'm not talking about competition. We're not talking about sometimes you have no choice. Do the best you can. But when you're training your athletes in practice, other than maybe having one final all-out burst and see what you got, all right, fine. That was your last set, though. Don't plan on doing another set if they're at that point. Okay. Running economy, ways to improve running economy. We said this back several chapters ago. We're talking about your capacity to be able to actually use less energy at the same level of effort, right? How do we do that? Get stronger, get physically stronger, get more flexible, get more mobile, improve skill, mobility, right? That's what we're talking about, ability, coordination, okay? Those factors all play a role in addition to our normal training towards endurance and whatnot as well. Will improve our running economy, okay? And then, of course, critical power, as we mentioned before, it's a steady state, so to speak, or whatever speed you can handle for longer periods. That's something that has to be trained with those more moderate length or intermediate, moderate length, 20-minute, 60-minute runs, somewhere in there, as opposed to much shorter than that, okay? And, of course, lastly, maximal anaerobic power strength. We're working on our type 2X muscle fibers. Critical power is more type 2A, mostly type 1 with some type 2A. And maximal anaerobic power and strength is 10 seconds or less, but you're still working in the 90+% range, around 20 seconds, maybe even 30 seconds for some people. That's why we say high intensity intervals, 20, 30 seconds work, and no more than 90 seconds rest. If you have to rest more than 90 seconds, we'd say that the intensity of that set is too high, and you're not going to get the benefit you're looking for by improving lactate threshold, by improving capacity to handle stress in that glycolytic pathway, predominantly with type 2A muscle fibers. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff to put into your head to try to keep clear, to know how to program properly. That's the thing I want to keep getting after you these last 3 weeks. If you have questions, please do let me know. And that said, final thoughts. Keep your performance plan clear. Like we mentioned, note those 4 primary areas of intensity. Everything you talk about. You talk about stress, fatigue, anything. You lost points, a lot of you this last week, because you had very short performance, short posts, thinking you just talked about stress and talking about fatigue and things that give problems to your athletes. How do you cope with it? what do you do specifically? Not just we have the right work-rest periods. We talk about nutrition. We talk about not doing certain things and how to handle it. Be specific. I got to be specific enough so at least I know more what you're talking about, and so I know you're getting the concepts, not just talking as if you didn't read the chapter or watch the weekly video, right? Okay. And that said, week 11 coming up here, a couple weeks out. That's our last exam. Otherwise, you just have Learn Smarts and discussion board posts till that time. That last exam is going to be 2.5 times, 1,000 points, versus a 400-point exams, 2.5 times more value than your previous 2 exams, because it is technically a final, but it is not cumulative. It's only going to be these chapters of weeks 9, 10, 11. Okay. That said, call or email if you have questions. You're getting right down to it. Performing well for the most part. Last week was a letdown for some of you. Want to make sure you don't let that happen these last 3 weeks. Get the most out of it you can. Keep pushing hard. Like the end of any race, the end of any sports event, anything you engage in, it's always its toughest when you get closer to the end, isn't it? Okay. Appreciate all your efforts. We'll talk to you again soon.